When my dear friend Craig Lampert was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, he was able to meet that diagnosis because he could draw on decades of self-inquiry and spiritual practice. And while he emphatically would have preferred more time in his life, he was able to meet the reality of death because he had discovered for himself, he had discovered and realized that death and birth are part of life. And he said, death is perfectly safe. He was able to walk into that next phase of his experience with presence. Now, for our self-sense, which tends to be fixated in some ways on our separation from life, to that degree, death doesn't feel safe at all. That's not a problem to solve. It's not a blame. It's not a criticism. It's a recognition that when we contract, when we knot ourselves up into any kind of defensive posture, and that could be happening anytime during the day, at least for me, when we knot ourselves up rather than openly participating in the unfolding experiences of our life, which always includes some kind of birth, some kind of living, and some kind of dying, then it's unsafe. And we shut down. We all experience many births and many deaths in our life. In many wisdom traditions, these are described as trainings for the, quote, big death that comes to us as the body breathes out for the final time and doesn't breathe back in. Now, the wisdom traditions all agree that, yes, we're in training and that our job here is to expand and open to become capable of meeting the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth with self-conscious awareness, with presence. We meet this cycle with every breath. We meet this cycle with every cycling of the rising of the sun, the setting of the sun, the sleep-wake cycle. We meet this psychologically as we move from one stage of development to the other, as relationships transform, as careers go through their own cycles of birth, death, and rebirth. So many cycles are always present in our life at so many different levels as invitations for us to wake up in the midst of that process. Now, there's a great text called Kriya Bindu. Bindu means like an essence, a dewdrop of Kriya, of spiritual wisdom, written by my guru, Goswami Kriyananda. And in that text, he says, the most vital task of all Kriya yogis is to have a complete understanding of the birth, death, and rebirth cycle. A complete understanding. The only way to have a complete understanding of anything is to have a complete an undefended experience of that thing, of that cycle, whether it's the complete experience of a flower, the complete experience of a breath, of a beloved, as we untangle the knots of defensiveness and open fully to have a complete experience. And truly, we know what that is. He continues in the text, when you find balanced self-conscious awareness, which is presence itself, in the midst of the birth, death, and rebirth cycle, then you no longer see, you no longer perceive birth or death as the ordinary earthling. We could say as the unawakened or untrained mind. At this moment, you understand deeply that birth and death are samadhi. Samadhi is the state of unification with life. Unification with life includes birth, death, and rebirth. Birth, death, and rebirth, you could say, is the breath rhythm, the pulsing, arising and subsiding, the expanding and contracting of life itself. And he says that's at that moment you know that birth and death are life itself, our samadhi, the sacred awakening. And thus the desire to escape birth and death ceases, and you are free from the anguish and pain of birth as well as death. We stop trying to escape from life and open unto it. Stop trying to escape from the experience of life and meet it fully. This is the key fundamental principle of Kriya Yoga. And this principle, the text says, transcends all other principles. So what is birth, death, and rebirth cycle? At one level, it is definitely the cycle that initiates with the birth of this body, with the inhaling that we first do as we come out of our mother's body, and the exhaling that we engage in as the body falls away. And then it is also the rebirth as we inhale into the astral, into the subtle realms, and live there to explore our dream of awakening until we move into another physical embodiment. So for most of us, when we think of birth, death, and rebirth, we're thinking of that cycle of embodiments, of incarnations. But for the mystic, this cycle is not primarily about physical embodiment. It's about self-conscious awareness or presence in this moment. So what does this have to do with chakras? Well, as we unknot the patterns of self-protection, we loosen the contractions of consciousness progressively through the levels of awakening, which are the chakra map themselves, are the chakra ladder, as it is called in the ancient texts. And we progressively then open up, open up, open up. We develop a taste and appreciation for what it feels like to go through that birth, death, and rebirth cycle, and to sustain continuity of consciousness through the process of releasing our identity from its self-protective strategies and becoming more and more intimate with the breath of life, the breath of life that has a physical, a subtle, and a super subtle dimension, the expansion and contraction of life itself. When the knots are tight, when self-protection dominates, awareness contracts and dims As the knots of the loosen, as the chakras open, we discover there is a grace. There is a grace that is always present. It's especially present as the forms of identity, as the forms of relationship, that does ring a bell, as the forms of experiences dissolve, dissolve, dissolve. And we open more and more fully to the truth of our nature, to the truth of life. We abide as presence in the midst of change. And with loving awareness, we welcome the rebirth, the beginning of a new adventure.